Just after 4 o'clock in the morning, in a fjord near the top of the world, a submarine the size of a small caravan hangs motionless in black water. Inside, 4 men breathe slowly in the dark. There is barely room to stand, barely room to turn. The air is close, thick with oil and salt and the damp heat of their own bodies. And above their heads, so near they could almost reach up and lay a hand on it, were the steel not in the way, sits 43,000 tons of the most feared warship in Europe, the battleship Tirpitz, sister of the Bismarck, a ship the Royal Navy has hunted from the air, from the sea, and from beneath the waves for the better part of 2 years, and failed every single time to sink. The men in the midget submarine have come to do what whole fleets and bomber squadrons could not. They have crossed 1,000 miles of open sea under tow.
They have crept through a minefield in the dark, past listening posts and patrol boats, and slipped through the anti-submarine nets that wall off the anchorage. And now they sit beneath the enemy's keel, with 4 tons of explosives strapped to the flanks of their tiny hull, and a pair of clockwork timers already turning. Their orders are simple and very nearly impossible. Release the charges onto the seabed, directly under the battleship. Wind the clocks, and then get out, back through the nets, back down the fjord, before the water erupts. They have made their peace with the arithmetic. Even if everything goes perfectly, the chances of coming home are thin. This is Operation Source, September 1943, and it is the story of how the largest battleship in Europe was brought down, not by a fleet, but by a handful of men in submarines you could park in a garden.
To understand why men would fold themselves into a craft like that and go looking for the Tirpitz, you first have to understand the shadow she cast across the whole war at sea. She was the heaviest battleship ever built by a European power, more than 800 feet of armored steel, displacing over 40,000 tons, mounting 8 15-inch guns that could throw a shell the weight of a small car more than 20 miles. She was fast, superbly protected, and almost impossibly hard to kill. On paper, she was a match for anything the Royal Navy could bring against her. And yet the strange truth of the Tirpitz is that she achieved nearly all of her power without ever fighting a great battle. She almost never fired those enormous guns in anger. She did not need to. She was what naval strategists call a fleet in being, a threat so serious that simply by existing, she bent the behavior of her enemies around her.
From her lairs in the Norwegian fjords, she sat astride the sea road to Russia. As long as she was there, the British could not risk sending their Arctic convoys north without holding a heavy fleet of their own capital ships ready in case she came out. She tied down battleships, cruisers, and aircraft carriers that were needed desperately elsewhere, in the Atlantic, in the Mediterranean, in the Far East. She did all of it while lying quietly at anchor. Her single greatest victory was won without her ever leaving harbor. In the summer of 1942, the mere possibility that the Tirpitz had put to sea threw the defense of convoy PQ-17 into chaos. Fearing she was bearing down on them, the Admiralty ordered the convoy to scatter. Stripped of their formation and their escort, the merchant ships were hunted down one at a time by aircraft and U-boats. Of 35 ships that had set out for Russia, only 11 arrived.
The rest, and much of the cargo and many of the men aboard them, went to the bottom of the Arctic. The Tirpitz had done that, sent 2/3 of a convoy to the seabed, simply by raising steam and staying at her moorings. It is little wonder, then, that Winston Churchill became almost fixated upon her. He called her destruction the greatest prize at sea. The whole strategy of the war, he wrote, could turn on the fate of this one ship. No other single target so occupied the minds of Britain's commanders. The trouble was reaching her. She lay far to the north, beyond the Arctic Circle, tucked into the narrow waters of Fjord, a slot of deep water walled in by bare mountains. Around her, the Germans had woven a defensive maze, minefields, listening gear, gun batteries on the heights, and layer upon layer of heavy anti-torpedo netting. The bombers of the day could barely fly that far, and when they did, they rarely hit. Torpedo aircraft could not reach her. A conventional submarine could not get through the nets. Surface ships would be seen and destroyed long before they arrived. For all practical purposes, the most valuable target in Europe was untouchable. And so, having exhausted the ordinary answers, the Admiralty turned to an extraordinary one, an idea that might have come from a boy's adventure paper.
If you could not send a battleship or a bomber to the Tirpitz, then perhaps you could send 4 men in a submarine small enough to crawl beneath her and lay the charge by hand.
The instrument of that idea was the X-craft. It was a submarine in miniature, a little over 50 feet from bow to stern, a fraction the length of an ordinary boat, and crewed by just 4 men. Inside there was no comfort and almost no space. A man could not stand fully upright, and the crew lived crouched among the valves and gauges and the constant cold sweat of condensation. It carried a tiny periscope, a modest engine, and a specialized wet and dry compartment through which a diver could squeeze out into the sea to cut through nets and squeeze back in again. It did not carry torpedoes. Instead, molded to each side of its hull were 2 great curved charges, side cargoes the crews called them, each holding around 2 tons of amytal explosive. The plan was not to strike the ship's side as a torpedo would, but to creep beneath the target, release the charges so that they sank to the seabed directly under the keel, wind their clockwork fuses, and steal away before they blew.
Detonated in the shallow water beneath a hull, that much explosive would not merely dent armor, it would break a ship's back. 6 of these craft were made ready for the operation: X5, X6, X7, X8, X9, and X10. Between them they were assigned the 3 great German warships then lurking in the north, the battleship Tirpitz, the battlecruiser Scharnhorst, and the heavy cruiser Lützow. But there was a problem no amount of courage could solve. The X-craft were far too small to reach Norway on their own. The answer was as bold as the rest of the plan. Each midget would be towed across the North Sea, more than 1,000 miles, behind a full-size submarine. To spare the fighting crews for the attack itself, a separate passage crew would nurse each craft during the long days under tow, then hand over to the fresh operational crew once they neared the Norwegian coast.
For months the men trained in the cold lochs of Scotland, learning to handle a boat that answered to the smallest touch, to pass through nets, to live and work in a steel box the size of a corridor. They were all volunteers. None of them was under any illusion about what they had agreed to. This was not the courage of the sudden moment, the kind that seizes a man in the heat of a charge. It was something colder and in its way harder, the courage to weigh the odds carefully in advance and to climb aboard anyway. The whole enterprise balanced on a knife edge of chance. Everything depended on the tow ropes holding through a week of heavy weather, on 6 fragile craft surviving a crossing they were never designed to make, on the crews arriving rested enough to fight, on the weather, the tides, and the nets, and on the Germans not looking in the wrong direction at the right moment.
Any one of 100 small failures could unravel it all. It was, by any sober assessment, a scheme with a very low chance of success and a very high chance of death. And it was, at the same time, the only plan anyone had that offered a real hope of reaching the Tirpitz at all. In the second week of September 1943, the towing submarines slipped out of a loch in the north of Scotland, each with a midget submarine trailing invisibly beneath the waves behind it, and set their course for the Arctic.
The crossing is a slow ordeal. For days the little craft ride deep behind their tow ropes, dragged half-blind through the gray swells of the North Sea. Every few hours they must come up to change their air and run their engines, then dive again into the dark. The passage crews are battered by the motion, deafened by the groan of the tow, half poisoned by their own foul air. It is exhausting, dangerous, unglamorous work, and it is where the operation first begins to come apart. Aboard X8, the side charges begin to leak and lose their buoyancy. The craft grows impossible to trim, wallowing and plunging without warning. There is no choice. Her charges are jettisoned, and the craft herself, useless now, is abandoned and scuttled. Her target, the Lützow, will go untouched. Then X9 is lost. Somewhere in the crossing her tow rope parts, and, heavy with water, she slips away and dives to the bottom of the sea, taking her passage crew with her. She is simply gone. There are no survivors. 2 of the 6 craft are lost before the enemy is even in sight. 4 remain. Off the Norwegian coast, under cover of darkness, the survivors slip their tows. The fresh operational crews take over. Now the midgets are on their own. threading north through a coastline of islands and channels, navigating by nerve and dead reckoning, past German patrols and lookout posts, into the long fjord that leads toward the anchorage. Here X-10's luck fails too. One fault after another cascades through her compass, her periscope, her firing gear. Blind and half crippled, unable to press home any attack on the Scharnhorst, she has no choice but to turn back, and later she too must be given up. And so it comes down to three midget submarines, X5, X6, and X7, for the great prize at the head of the fjord, the Tirpitz. In the small hours of the 22nd of September, they begin their final run.
Ahead lie the last defenses, the lines of heavy netting that seal off the battleship's berth. There is no cutting through steel here. The way in is to slip through the gaps the enemy leaves for his own traffic. X7 works through the boat passage and then dives beneath the anti-torpedo nets that ring the ship herself, blind, a few feet from the enemy, trusting the depth gauge and her own nerve. Aboard X6, everything is going wrong and being beaten back by sheer will. Her periscope has flooded, leaving her all but blind. She slips inside in the wake of a small coaster while the gate stands open, then keeps blundering to the surface in the growing light. On the deck of the Tirpitz, a lookout even glimpses something in the water, but takes it for a porpoise or a piece of drifting debris and looks away. Her commander drives her on regardless, feeling his way toward the vast dark shape of the hull.
One by one, in the gray dawn, they pass inside the last barrier. They are now in the water close around the battleship, inside her guard, beneath the muzzles of guns built to duel with other battleships, in craft so small the great ship's crew can scarcely credit that they exist. X5, commanded by Lieutenant Henty Creer, is seen at a distance out near the nets. Exactly what happens to her in these minutes has been argued over ever since, including whether she too got her charges away before the end. What is certain is grim enough. She is spotted, the Tirpitz opens fire, and under a storm of gunfire and depth charges, X5 goes down with her crew. She will not come home. But X6 and X7 are through. They have done the thing that every plan, every calculation, every sober assessment said was nearly impossible. They are underneath the Tirpitz, and slung to their sides, ready to fall away into the dark water and settle on the seabed beneath 40,000 tons of enemy steel, are their charges and their clocks.
Beneath the battleship, Lieutenant Donald Cameron works his crippled X6 into position and lets his charges go. They drop away and settle on the bottom, hard under the Tirpitz. He winds the timers. It is done. But X6 is finished. Damaged, half-blind, barely answering her controls, she can no longer hide. She breaks surface right alongside the towering gray hull, in full view of the enemy. There is no escape now, and Cameron knows it. His last act is to make certain the Germans cannot seize his craft and her secrets. He opens the vents and scuttles her where she floats. As she goes down, the four men scramble clear, and are hauled, soaked and exhausted, onto the deck of the Tirpitz herself. It is a strange and terrible moment. The prisoners stand on the deck of the very ship they have come to destroy, saying nothing, giving nothing away, while somewhere in the black water beneath their feet, their charges lie on the seabed, and the clocks tick down.
Not far off, Lieutenant Godfrey Place has brought X7 through as well and released her charges under the ship. But the escape is a nightmare. Trying to slip back out, X7 blunders into the nets and jams fast, snared in the steel mesh, struggling to work herself free as the minutes drain away. On board the Tirpitz, alarm is spreading. The sight of a midget submarine surfacing and being scuttled alongside has told the Germans all they need to know. Orders are shouted. They try to heave the great ship sideways on her mooring cables to drag her off the spot where the charges must be lying. They slam watertight doors. They train their guns on the water. But a battleship cannot be moved in a moment, and there is almost no time left. At 12 minutes past 8 in the morning, the sea beneath the Tirpitz erupts. Something close to 8 tons of explosive, 4 from each of the two craft, detonates on the seabed beneath her hull. A vast column of water and smoke is flung up alongside her, and the battleship, all 43,000 tons of her, is heaved bodily upward, lifted in the water and slammed down again as though a giant had struck her from below. The blow is catastrophic. Down in her hull, plating buckles and seams split, and the sea floods in. A great gun turret weighing hundreds of tons is jolted clean off its bearings. Engines are torn from their mountings. The delicate rangefinders and fire control gear, the eyes and brain of her gunnery, are shattered in an instant. Lights fail. Compartments flood. In a single heartbeat, the most powerful warship in Europe is turned from a predator into a wreck at her own moorings. The captured crew of X6, still standing on her deck, feel the whole ship leap beneath them. X7, snared in the nets, is flung about by the shock and badly damaged. Place manages to bring her to the surface, where he and a surviving member of his crew are taken prisoner in their turn.
When the water settles and the smoke thins, the Tirpitz is still afloat. The raid has not sunk her, but she is broken, down at the head, flooded, half-blinded, her machinery ruined. The Queen of the North, who had ruled a whole ocean simply by existing, has been crippled in her own front garden by a handful of men in submarines no bigger than a caravan.
The reckoning was heavy. Of the 6 X-craft that had set out, not one came home. X8 and X10 had been scuttled. X9 lay on the bed of the North Sea with her passage crew. X5 had been shot to pieces near the nets. And X6 and X7, having done everything asked of them and more, lay wrecked in the shadow of the ship they had crippled. In all, 9 men were killed in the operation, and 6 were taken prisoner. Some had died on the long crossing, lost with X9 before they ever saw the enemy. Some had died in the final approach, under the guns of the Tirpitz. Of the 2 crews who actually pressed home the attack and laid their charges, not all came back, and those who survived did so as captives, marched off into long years behind wire in German prison camps. 2 of those prisoners were the commanders who had taken their craft beneath the battleship, Lieutenant Donald Cameron of X6 and Lieutenant Godfrey Place of X7.
They had driven damaged, half-blind craft through minefields and nets and into the very heart of the enemy's anchorage, with almost no expectation of survival, and they had succeeded. In February 1944, while both men were still prisoners of war, the London Gazette carried the announcement. Cameron and Place had each been awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest decoration for valor that Britain can bestow. It is a rare thing for the cross to be given to men who cannot come to receive it, who are at that moment sitting in enemy captivity. It was recognition of something the citation could only gesture at, that these were men who had gone clear-eyed into an attack that reason said they would not survive. And that is perhaps the hardest thing to hold in the mind about Operation Source. This was not a courage born of the sudden, blinding chaos of battle, where a man acts before he has time to be afraid.
These crews had months to think about what they were doing. They had trained for it in the cold locks of home. They had lain in their bunks on the long tow north, with nothing to do but turn the odds over in their minds. They knew, with cold clarity, how small their chances were. And when the moment came, they folded themselves into their tiny craft, took up the tow, and went anyway. It is easy, at the distance of many years, to speak of tonnage and timers and strategic effect, and to forget that the story turns, in the end, on a very small number of very young men in a very dark and frightening place. They did a thing that whole fleets and air forces had failed to do. Most of them paid for it with their lives or their freedom. The great ship they broke would be repaired and would float again, but the men of the X-craft had proven that she could be reached and hurt, and that she was not, after all, beyond the arm of her enemies.
The Tirpitz did not sink that morning, but she was never the same ship again. The damage done in those few seconds kept her out of action for roughly 6 months. Teams of engineers and workers labored through the Arctic winter to patch her hull, pump out her flooded compartments, and coax her ruined machinery back to life. By the spring of 1944, she could, in theory, steam and fight once more. But the spell she had cast was broken. She would never again roam as a true fighting ship, never again send a convoy scattering by the mere rumor of her movement. The thing at the heart of a warship like her, the belief of her enemies that she was invincible, had been carried off into the fjord by the men of the X-craft, and her enemies did not let her rest.
In April 1944, carrier aircraft of the Fleet Air Arm swept in low over the fjord and struck her again from the air, in the attack known as Operation Tungsten.
Through the year, the raids kept coming. And finally, on the 12th of November 1944, the heavy bombers of the Royal Air Force found her with their enormous tallboy bombs off the port of Tromsø. Struck and set ablaze, the great battleship rolled over and capsized, taking many of her crew with her. The long hunt was over. But it was Operation Source that had first broken her, that had reached out across 1,000 miles of sea, past every defense the Germans could devise, and shown that even the mightiest warship afloat was not safe. Everything that came after was, in a sense, the finishing of what those few midget submarines had begun. There is a quiet lesson in it, the kind the sea seems to keep teaching. The Tirpitz was the product of vast industry, tens of thousands of tons of steel, the labor of thousands of hands, the pride of a nation's navy.
And she was first laid low by an idea so modest it could almost be built in a shed. A little steel tube, 4 men, a pair of charges, and a willingness to go where no one believed a submarine could go. Today the fjord is quiet again. The mountains still stand over that stretch of cold, deep water where the giant once lay at anchor, and where a handful of young men in impossibly small craft crept beneath her keel and changed the war at sea. Most of them never came home, but they left behind a truth that outlived the ship and the war, and even the fear she once commanded, that no target is truly beyond reach, and that the largest things in the world can be undone by the smallest, if only the courage is there to try.